This is episode number 95, part 3. Just a quick follow-up. In the last video, I had come to the conclusion that I was failing certain scenarios when I was trying to write basically the low byte, my low byte RAM. Word writes were working fine. Writing to the upper byte on my data bus was working fine, but the lower byte writes, which is what these 4 fails would be indicating, was failing. So failing byte writes on even addresses. So with that, I went and pulled up my PSOC logic, and I looked at that, and really the logic I have here is quite simple for RAM reads and writes. And so I thought, okay, that doesn't seem like that's the issue here. And so the conclusion I came to there is really there's not much here to go wrong, quite honestly. And there really wasn't a differentiation between upper byte, lower byte, high byte, low byte. You know, this is really, am I reading or writing RAM, and am I enabling that? So I kind of ruled that out. I'm going to say the PSOC I didn't think was an issue. I went back to my schematic and I started looking at that and seeing, okay, if I want to be able to troubleshoot this, you know, when are these 2 RAM chips, the high and the low, when are they basically enabled? So they both have the same write enable signal. So that, I figure, if I'm writing to one but not the other one correctly, it's probably not that signal. But then if I come down here and I look at the chip enable, one of them is tied to A0 and one of them is tied to this BHE active low BHE pound signal. And as I looked at the spreadsheet, it seemed like that brought me to the conclusion that there's something wrong with the BHE signal on this high byte. So what was happening, I was trying to write just to the low byte, but something with BHE wasn't working right, and it was also writing to this byte, and it was reading a 0 and putting zeros in where it shouldn't have been putting zeros in. So I figured, okay, I got an issue with the BHE. That same BHE signal comes up to my ROM, and that maybe then I'm having the same issue with ROM reads if I'm trying to read. It seemed like this was only happening with writes. So maybe with my ROM, it's a non-issue because of timing or something else is working okay there on the ROM side, but not on the RAM. And if I look at BHE, it's really just connected between ROM and RAM on those 2 pins. And in addition to that, it's coming from my processor. I have a BHE signal up here. And if I look on all through my schematic, I see it on my processor, I see it on my ROM, I see it on my RAM, and then I see it on my ISA slots, and that's it. So that's it. It's like, okay. So I looked at that, I ohmed that out, I put a scope on it. Signal looked fine, nice, you know, high voltage, the voltage I was expecting all the way across the board. So I went back to the documentation for the processor, and I was looking at the schematic here, well, not a schematic, this high-level block diagram, and they're showing BHE going through a latch, which I'm not latching it. You know, I'm latching my address signals. If I go back to that, and I go to the right, you know, all my address signals down here are latched, but I'm not latching BHE. So I thought, let's try that. So what I did is I came down to this RAM chip just for a test. I pulled up the pin out of the socket for pin number 22, BHE, and I brought that over to this U10, which I had 2 open spots on this control latch. So I pulled up pin 12 and just ran a quick jumper wire between those 2 pins. And then I pulled up this pin 9, which is the incoming into that control latch. And I basically ran that for now over to the ROM BHE. In other words, that's connecting back to the processor. So the short of that is, instead of BHE going straight to my RAM, I'm running it through this control latch now into my RAM. And with that, then that gets me to, you know, this same test code that I'm using. But if I pull up my output, you're now going to see that there are no zeros in here. So this ends up coming out clean now. So my test, I write out all 9s. And again, that's writing out here. And I read it back in word style. I read it back in bytes. I then did the same thing to the memory variable that's at an odd placement and did the same testing. All that, I filled in with 9s. Then I wrote out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, A, B, C, D. And you can see that looks good in all 4 of those quadrants. I write out 9s. I get down to this testing here. And A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That looks good. I write out all 9s. And then I come in here and I write out in a different order, but the result I'm looking for is 9, 9, A, B, C, D, E, F. That looks great. So then I continue down 7. Step 7 here is all 9s. Then I'm going to write out E, F, A, B, C, D for number 8. E, F, A, B, C, D. That all looks great. All 9s. I get to test 10. And there's my 23.99, 45.99, and 67.99. So that all looks good, all 9s. And then this final test, and you can see that all matches. So that one change, which is a relatively minor change on my overall system, was to run that signal through a control latch. And that took care of the issue. Now, what I probably need to do, I'm just using temporary little jumper wires for this. I probably will now have to come down to this RAM. I think I will straighten that pin, get it put back in, and cut a trace and run that over to this pin on this chip. I won't have to do any trace cutting there because it wasn't connected to anything. I'll have to pull this pin from ground or leave it up and solder a wire and get that wire over to pin 1 of the processor. And so if I disconnect this RAM and ROM from the processor, run it through the latch, it's just going to be some simple either soldering on the chip, on the pins themselves if I leave them pulled up and do it that way, or if I actually go to cut traces. We'll see which one I end up doing here. But that seems to take care of the RAM issue. Now, maybe I have a similar ROM issue. It seemed like on reads, it didn't seem to be an issue, but I will probably correct this because I'm sure that same latching should happen for the ROM, even though right now maybe that's not causing me any grief. So I think this ended up being a fairly easy fix in the grand scheme of things. So now that's going to take me into booting it back up to FreeDOS just to see if this has any impact on the results I was seeing there.